Chapter 1. Introduction. A day in the life of medieval England. In the year 1320, in a village whose name has been worn off the map by 7 centuries of weather, a woman named Edith opened her eyes in total darkness and knew without a window, without a clock, without a single sound she could name, that it was time to get up. She'd not heard a rooster. The rooster would not bother for another hour. She simply knew, the way you know the weight of your own hand, that the night was nearly spent and the fire had gone to ash. There is no alarm in this world. There is no light switch. There is, in the whole of her village, not one device that measures an hour, unless you count the church bell. And the church bell is still asleep with everyone else. And yet she rises at very nearly the same moment. She rose yesterday, and the day before, and every working morning of her 34 years, because the body, given enough cold mornings, becomes its own clock patient, accurate, and entirely unforgiving. Tonight we are going to spend an entire day inside that world, one full turn of the sun across a corner of medieval England. And we are going to spend it not as tourists, glancing at castles and crowns, but down in the mud and the smoke and the wool, beside the people who actually lived there. A peasant woman before dawn, a wool merchant at the height of the market, a minor lord in the long shadows of his own hall, 3 lives one day, and a world stitched quietly between them. But here is the part that still puzzles the people who study this for a living. By every measure we would reach for today, diet, comfort, safety, the simple odds of living, to see 40 Edith's life was brutally, relentlessly hard. And yet when you sift through what actually survives of her world, the dry court rolls, the parish accounts, the scattered words of people like her, a strange shape begins to appear in the record. It suggests that Edith, this exhausted woman rising in the cold before the birds, may have had more genuine rest across the year, more whole days with no work demanded of her at all than the average person watching this video tonight. How is that possible? How could a woman who owned almost nothing and owed almost everything 2 days of labor a week to a man she had never spoken to, a tithe to a church she could not read, somehow end up with more rest than us, with all our machines and all our weekends? Hold that question in the back of your mind. We are going to walk all the way through this day to answer it. And the answer, when it comes, will not be sitting in a book of philosophy. It will be sitting in Edith's lap, in the form of something very small and very warm, near the end of the day. We will get there. Before we settle in, though, if you enjoy what we do here, a quiet like or a subscribe genuinely helps these long journeys keep getting made. And if you grew up working land yourself, or you remember stories your parents or grandparents told about life before, the conveniences we now take for granted, the wood stove, the well, the long dark winters with no electric light, I would especially love to hear those memories down in the comments. They belong here. Now dim the lights. Maybe switch on a fan for that soft background hum. Pull the blanket up and let us ease into this day together, one slow hour at a time. It is a Tuesday, as near as we can place it, a working day, an ordinary day, the kind of day that almost never makes it into the histories, precisely because nothing happened. No king died, no battle was fought, no charter was sealed, which is exactly why it is worth our time. Because the ordinary Tuesday is where the overwhelming majority of all human life has actually been lived, and it is the one thing the grand histories almost always leave out. So let us not rush her. Let us follow Edith out of the dark and into the cold morning at exactly the pace she lived it, which is to say, slowly, deliberately, with her whole body, because there was no faster way to do any of it. And as we go, the bones of her world who owns the land, what she owes, why she is awake before the sun, will reveal themselves not as a lecture, but simply as the things she touches, carries, and quietly resents on her way to the well. We will also, before this day is over, sit at a wool merchant's counting table 20 miles east, while the most valuable thing in England changes hands, and we will climb the hill to the Lord's Hall, where the same world looks entirely different from above. But all of that is hours away yet. For now, there is only Edith in the cold and a bucket that bangs against her knee. Let us begin where she begins. Chapter 2. Before dawn, a peasant woman wakes. The first thing Edith does, before she eats, before she speaks, before she so much as straightens her back fully, is kneel at the hearth and save the fire. This is not a chore. This is closer to a religion. The fire in the center of her one-room house was not lit fresh each morning the way you might strike a match. It was kept, banked low under a careful blanket of ash through the whole of the night, so that a single living ember could be coaxed back into flame at dawn. Letting the fire die completely was a small catastrophe. It meant walking in the cold, sometimes a quarter mile, to a neighbor's house to beg a burning coal carried home in a clay pot, and arriving to that particular look that says you are the sort of woman who lets her fire go out. And so she breathes on the embers, slow, even breaths, the way you would calm a frightened animal, and feeds them slivers of birch until a flame stands up, no taller than a thumb. The smoke rises and finds its way out through the thatch, because there is no chimney. There is, in this house, no chimney at all. The smoke simply hangs in the upper third of the room in a permanent blue haze and seeps out through the roof, which is why the underside of the thatch is black and greasy with soot, and why, if you spent a winter in this house, you would carry the smell of it in your hair until spring. Forget central heating. Forget a flue. Forget even a window worth the name. Here, the price of warmth was breathing smoke for half your life, and the medieval poor paid it without complaint, because the alternative was the cold, and the cold killed. Now, while the fire takes, look around the room with me, because the whole of Edith's economic universe is contained inside these four walls, and you can see almost all of it from where she kneels. The house is perhaps 15 feet by 20. It has one room. In that room sleep Edith, her husband, and 3 living children. There were 5. 2 did not survive their first years, and we will come back to that, because the arithmetic of medieval childhood is one of the hardest and most important things to understand about this world. Against the far wall, behind a low wooden partition, stands the single most valuable thing the family owns, breathing slow clouds into the cold: an ox. Here is the detail that I want to lodge in your mind tonight, because once you understand it, you understand almost everything about Edith's world. That ox, standing in the corner of her bedroom, was worth more money than every other thing the family owned put together. More than the iron pot, which was precious. More than the wool on every back in the house. More by a cold and uncomfortable margin than Edith herself would have fetched, had such a thing been thinkable, which it was not. An ox cost something like 13 shillings. Months and months of a laborer's wages, and a family that lost its ox to disease or theft or simple bad luck did not lose a possession. It lost the ability to plow. And a family that cannot plow cannot plant, and a family that cannot plant does not eat. And so the ox in the corner was not livestock. It was the difference between this life and starvation, sleeping 8 feet from her head. So when Edith pulls her shawl tight and steps out into the frost with her bucket, she is not stepping onto her own land. She does not own the strip of earth she is walking toward. No one in her village does, not really. The land belongs to Sir Walter, who lives in the stone house on the hill, whom she has seen perhaps a dozen times in her life, and spoken to never, and to whom she owes as a fact of her birth, as fixed as the weather 2 days of her labor every week, and more at harvest, on his fields, before she may touch her own. She thinks about this roughly the way you might think about gravity, not as a system to be questioned, as a fact of the world. The bucket bangs against her knee as she walks, and the frost crunches under shoes worn thin as paper, and her breath goes out ahead of her in a cloud. The well is the village's beating heart, and it is also its newspaper, its courtroom of public opinion, and its only reliable source of news. By the time Edith arrives, 2 other women are already there. Old Agnes, who is perhaps 50 and therefore ancient, and young Cecily, with her first baby strapped to her back. There is no plumbing here. There is no tap. Every drop of water that will be drunk, cooked with, or used to wash anything in Edith's house today must be hauled up by hand from the stone shaft and carried home on a yoke across her shoulders, and water is heavy. A full bucket runs to 30 pounds or more, which is one quiet reason medieval people washed so little. It was not that they loved being dirty. It was that cleanliness, measured in buckets carried uphill at dawn, was simply very expensive. And it is at the well this morning that Edith hears the first piece of news that will matter to her day, that the reeve, the man chosen from among the villagers themselves to organize the Lord's work, a sort of unpaid medieval foreman who answered to the Lord above and was resented by the neighbors below, has decided that the Lord's barley must be threshed today, which means Edith's own plans, whatever they were, are now irrelevant. This is one of the deepest truths of her life, and she absorbs it without visible reaction, the way you absorb rain. Her time was not entirely her own. A portion of it, a known and fixed portion, belonged to someone else, and that someone had just spent it for her. Chapter 3. What was really on a medieval breakfast table? Let us talk about food, because we are going to be hungry alongside these people all day, and the medieval diet is one of the things modern audiences get most spectacularly wrong. Picture a breakfast table, if you can call a plank, laid on 2 trestles a table. There is no plate. There is no fork. The fork will not arrive in England in any common way for centuries, and when it does, people will think it faintly ridiculous and possibly sinful. What there is bread, and what there is in a poor house in 1320 is not the golden wheat loaf you are imagining. Wheat was a cash crop. Wheat was for selling, for the Lord's table, for white bread that the poor saw mostly at weddings and feasts. Edith's bread is dark, dense, and made of rye and barley, sometimes stretched in a bad year with ground beans and peas, a loaf so heavy you could, in the words of more than one frustrated historian, have used it to stun a fish. The other thing on the table, the thing that was on the table at very nearly every meal of Edith's entire life, was pottage. Pottage is the quiet hero of the medieval kitchen, and it is essentially this: a pot that never fully empties and never fully stops cooking. into which goes whatever the household has: oats, barley, peas, beans, an onion, a leek, a handful of herbs from the garden, a scrap of bacon if it is a good week and the saints are smiling. You eat some. You add more the next day. The pot simmers at the edge of the fire for weeks, even months. A kind of edible diary of everything the family has eaten and grown. It was nourishing, it was warm, it was endless, and it was, by any honest account, deeply and profoundly monotonous. Those who remember the lean stretches of the Depression, when a single pot on the stove had to stretch across a family and a week, you understand pottage better than any cookbook could explain it. Meat was rare on a table like this, and when it came mostly from the pig, because the pig was the poor family's masterpiece of economic planning. A pig could be fed on scraps and acorns and turned loose in the autumn woods to fatten itself for free, and then, slaughtered as the cold came in, it gave back bacon and salted pork that could be hung in the smoke and stretched across the bleak months. Almost nothing was wasted. The blood became pudding. The fat became cooking grease and rushlight. The bladder became a child's toy. The bristles were saved. Hygiene in the handling of all this. Let us not ask too many questions. The point is that this was not a poverty of imagination. It was a masterclass in making everything go as far as it could possibly go, the kind of thrift our grandparents would have recognized in their bones. The children eat first, or rather they eat at the same time, but with the particular focus of the perpetually slightly hungry. The eldest, a boy of 10, already does a near adult share of the work minding the animals, scaring birds from the crop in season, fetching and carrying without being asked, because the alternative is being told. There was no long, protected childhood here. No decade of schooling and play before the world asked anything of you. By 7, a child had real jobs. By 10 or 12, they were, in any practical sense, a small adult who happened to be short. And we will come back a little later tonight to the strange and tender question of whether medieval parents loved their children the way we do. Because for a long time, serious historians genuinely argued that they could not have, given how many they lost. And they were, I think, completely wrong about that. But that is a story for the afternoon. Chapter 4, The House She Lives In and How It Was Made. Before we follow the wool, stand for a moment and really look at the house Edith has just walked back into, because she did not buy it from a builder. Her house was made by hand, by people she knew, out of the ground it stands on, for almost no money at all, and that is a marvel we have entirely forgotten how to see. The bones of it are crux, great curved timbers, often a single tree split down the middle, so the two halves match, reared up in pairs like the ribs of an upturned boat to carry the whole weight of the roof. Raising those crux was a job no family did alone. The neighbors came, the way they came for everything, and a house raising was half labor and half festival, paid back in ale and in the certainty that you would come when it was their turn. Between the timbers go the walls, and the walls are mud, or rather wattle and daub, which sounds primitive and is in fact a small triumph of cheap engineering. Thin hazel rods are woven between the uprights into a basket-like panel, the wattle. Over it is smeared the daub, a mixture of clay, sand, straw, and, yes, animal dung, which dries to a hard, surprisingly warm, weather-shedding wall that can be patched in an afternoon with materials lying about the yard. Forget brick. Forget poured concrete. Forget a mortgage that follows you for 30 years. Edith's walls cost the labor of her own hands and the muck from her own byre, and when a corner cracked, she did not call anyone. She mixed a fresh batch of daub and pressed it in with her palm, and the wall was whole again by supper. Over it all goes the thatch, and the thatch is genuinely clever, a thick coat of straw or reed, layered so that water runs down the outside and never reaches the inside. Warm in winter and cool in summer, and home, it must be said, to a permanent population of mice, insects, and the occasional nesting bird, which is one reason the cat earned its keep. A good thatch could last decades with patching. It was also, of course, alarmingly flammable, and the open fire smoking away beneath it was a danger every single night, which is precisely why saving and banking that fire so carefully was a matter of survival in more ways than one. The whole house, in the end, was a thing the land gave up freely: timber, mud, straw, stone shaped by skilled hands into shelter, and owing nobody anything but the labor and the knowing. Chapter 5. The open fields and the heavy plough. And the land that house sits on was farmed in a way so strange to modern eyes that it is worth slowing right down to see it. Edith's village did not farm in tidy separate farms. It farmed in 2 or 3 vast open fields, each divided into hundreds of long, thin strips, and a single family's holding was not 1 block of land, but a scatter of strips spread all across those fields. A strip of good ground here, a strip of stony ground there, a wet strip down by the brook. It looks mad until you understand the logic. With no way to insure against a bad patch, you shared out the good and the bad, so that no one family was ruined by the luck of where they stood. It was risk spread across a whole community, written into the very shape of the ground. The plough itself was the great machine of the age, and it was a beast to work. The heavy wheeled plough that broke England's wet clay soils needed a team of oxen to pull it, sometimes as many as 8, and almost no single family owned 8 oxen. So the team, like the field, was shared. Each household put in what beasts it had, and the great communal plough went round the strips of all of them in turn. This is the quiet truth at the bottom of Edith's whole world. The thing that no diagram of feudalism ever quite captures, that survival here was not individual but collective, that you literally could not plow your own land without your neighbor's animals walking beside your own, and that the deepest law of the village was not the Lord's law, but the older, harder law of mutual need. Watch how the plow turns the soil, because it leaves a signature that outlasts everyone who ever touched it. The heavy plow threw the earth always to one side, and working a strip up and down, year on year, century on century, slowly built the ground into long, low ridges with furrows between the ridge and furrow that, as we will see when this whole day is done, still ripples under the grass of English fields 700 years later, the literal fingerprint of medieval labor pressed permanently into the land. Edith will never know that her work will outlast cathedrals. She only knows that the furrow must be straight, that the oxen must not be overdriven, and that the light is good and the rain is holding off, and that today, at least, the great slow machine of the field is turning as it should. Chapter 6. The animals that kept a family alive. We have met the ox, the family's treasure, but he did not stand alone in the yard, and the other animals each earned their keep with a precision that would impress any accountant. The pig we have spoken of, the great autumn provider, turned loose to fatten on woodland acorns for free and slaughtered into a winter's worth of bacon and salt pork. The hens gave eggs, which were both food and a small, saleable surplus, a few pennies a woman could call her own. A cow, if the family was fortunate enough to own one, gave milk that became cheese and butter, the preserved protein that carried a household through lean months. And every one of these animals, even the smallest, gave something else that mattered enormously and that we never think of: muck. It sounds like a joke, but it is one of the most serious facts of medieval farming. Animal manure was the only fertilizer this world had, and without it, the soil slowly starved and the harvests failed. This is the real reason the animals so often lived inside or right beside the house, not merely for warmth, though that mattered, but because every cartload of dung was precious, gathered and heaped and spread on the fields and the garden to keep the ground alive. A family with more animals had more muck, and more muck meant better crops, and better crops meant more animals, a slow, patient cycle that a careful household could climb, and a struck-down one could fall out of in a single bad year. They understood this perfectly. They were not ignorant peasants flinging seed at dead ground. They were managing a living system with the accumulated wisdom of 100 generations, and the smell of the dung heap in the yard was to Edith very nearly the smell of safety. Chapter 7. The mill, the bread, and a tax you could taste. There is one more place Edith's grain must go before it becomes bread, and it is a place she resents quietly every time she walks to it: the Lord's mill. She is not permitted to grind her own grain freely at home with a simple hand quern, though she could easily, and though her grandmother did. By the custom of the manor she is bound, the word is soak, to bring her grain to Sir Walter's watermill and to pay the miller a portion of it for the grinding, a portion that goes, in the end, to the Lord. It is a tax she can taste, levied on the most basic act of feeding her family, and the miller, who takes his cut by the scoop, was for that reason one of the most universally suspected men in any village. The fat miller with his thumb on the scale is a stock figure of medieval complaint, and he did not earn the reputation by accident. And even the baking could be bound by the Lord's monopoly. In many manors, the tenants were obliged to bake their bread in the Lord's oven for another small fee, rather than build ovens of their own. Edith, like many, makes do at the hearth with flat, dense loaves baked on a hot stone, or carries her risen dough to a neighbor with a better oven, the favor repaid in the endless soft currency of village life. Think of it. The grain she grew, on land she did not own, threshed in the Lord's barn as owed labor, ground at the Lord's mill for a cut, perhaps baked in the Lord's oven for a fee, the Lord's hand resting lightly, but unmistakably, on every single stage between the seed and the supper. She does not rage about it, she simply knows it, the way she knows the weather, and she eats the bread anyway because it is bread, and there are children, and the bread is warm. Chapter 8. The clothes on her back and the wool that ran England. Look at what Edith is wearing, because almost every thread of it began as the back of a sheep, and almost every thread of it passed through her own hands or her mother's. She wears a long undershift of linen against the skin linen, because it could be washed, because it was cool in summer, and could be boiled clean, which wool could not. Over it goes the kirtle, the long woolen dress in the natural grays and browns and dirty whites of undyed fleece, because dye cost money, and bright color was, quite literally, a way of wearing your wealth where everyone could see it. A peasant in vivid scarlet would have looked as strange and suspect as a man mowing his lawn today in a tuxedo. Color was not fashion. Color was rank, worn outdoors. And here's the thing that would stop a modern person cold. Edith owns, in all likelihood, 2 sets of clothes, perhaps 3. Not 2 closets, 2 sets, a working kirtle and a slightly better one kept for church and feast days, and that is the wardrobe of an adult woman entire. Clothing was so valuable that it was specifically listed in wills, handed down by name from mother to daughter, patched and turned and re-sewn until the original cloth had been almost entirely replaced by patches, like a ship rebuilt plank by plank. When you next stand in front of a closet wondering what to wear, spare a thought for a woman who could carry her whole wardrobe over one arm, and who would have regarded the contents of an average modern dresser as the hoard of a minor queen. Now hold that humble, undyed kirtle in your mind, because we are going to follow that wool on a journey today out of Edith's village, onto the back of a pack horse, into a market town 20 miles east, and from there, believe it or not, across the sea to the great cloth cities of Flanders, where English wool was prized above almost any other in Europe. The sheep, grazing on that gray hillside above the village, were not a quaint detail of country life. They were the engine of the English economy, the oil of their age, and the wool on Edith's back connected her, by an invisible thread she would never trace, to bankers in Florence and weavers in Bruges. We will meet the man who handled that thread, a wool merchant named Geoffrey, at the height of the market today. But his world makes no sense until we have finished standing in Edith's. So let us stay here a while longer. And then, across the cold morning air, comes the sound that organized every single day of Edith's life more completely than any clock: the church bell. It rings for the hours, the rhythm of monastic prayer that spilled out of the monasteries and structured the whole of medieval time. There's no 8 o'clock in Edith's world. There's prime at sunrise. There's terce in mid-morning. There's sext at noon, and none in mid-afternoon, and vespers as the light goes. People did not agree to meet at a number. They agreed to meet after sext, or before vespers, and the bell told everyone, all at once, where they stood in the day. The church did not merely own Edith's Sundays. It owned the very units she measured time in, and she would no more have questioned that than you question the existence of the minute. Chapter 9, Faith, the Tithe, and the Shape of Belief. As Edith passes the church, she passes the building next to it, and the building next to it is bigger. It is the tithe barn, and it is enormous, and its size tells you everything. The tithe was the 10th. 1/10 of everything Edith's family grew or raised the 10th sheaf, the 10th lamb, the 10th cheese went to the church, gathered into that vast barn, whether the year had been kind or cruel. In a good year, it was a heavy weight. In a year of famine, and there had been one only a few years before, the great famine that killed perhaps 1/10 of all England, when the rains would not stop, the tithe was a wound. And yet Edith pays it, and more than pays it. Because to her, this is not extortion. This is the price of the soul's safety. And the soul's safety was the most real and pressing concern of her entire existence. We have to be careful here, because it is terribly easy for a modern person to look at medieval faith and see only fear and control. And that is a thin and condescending reading. Yes, the church was wealthy and powerful and sometimes corrupt, and Edith would have known a lazy priest from a good one as well as anyone. But the faith itself was not a cage she longed to escape. It was the water she swam in. It gave her a calendar, a community, a reason, an explanation for suffering that no one in her world could otherwise explain, and a promise that the brutal arithmetic of this life was not the whole story. When she looks at the painted wall of the church, the only pictures she will ever see, the only art, vivid scenes of heaven and judgment glowing above the altar. She's not looking at propaganda. She's looking at the single window her world offers onto something larger than mud, and she finds it, in the most literal sense, a comfort. The lane bends, and now Edith is walking toward the manor, not the hall itself. She would never go there, but the Lord's barn and yard, where the day's owed work waits. And as she passes the gatehouse, she does a small thing without thinking, a thing that tells you more about the feudal order than any diagram could. She glances up at the hall, and she mutters, half under her breath, the name of Sir Walter, not as a curse exactly, and not as a blessing, but the way you might say the name of the bank that holds your mortgage. He is the weather she lives under. His grandfather granted this land. His court fines her neighbors for letting their pigs stray. His mill is the only mill she is permitted to grind her grain at, for a fee. His name is on the very air, and he, at this hour, is still asleep in a soft bed, which she knows, and which she does not waste energy resenting, because resenting the weather changes nothing about whether it rains. Chapter 10. Owed Labor, the work that wasn't hers. Inside the Lord's barn, the work is threshing, and is exactly as hard and as rhythmic and as dusty as you would imagine. Threshing means beating the grain free of the straw with a flail, 2 stout sticks joined by a leather hinge, swung up and over and down, again and again and again, for hours. The air fills with chaff and dust that coats the throat and the lungs. The noise is a steady, hypnotic thudding, and the work is owed. This is the labor service, the boon work, the 2 days a week that Edith's tenancy demands, and she does it alongside her neighbors, not because she is paid, but because she was born into a bargain her great-grandparents struck. Land to till in exchange for labor given. No money changes hands. That is the quiet engine at the bottom of the whole pyramid, a relationship measured not in wages but in days, in sweat, in the 10th sheaf, in the 2-day week. But notice something about how this work is measured, because it is the first thread of the answer to our opening question. Edith is not working an 8-hour shift. There's no clock on the barn wall counting her down to freedom. The work is the task. The barley must be threshed, and when it is threshed, the day's owed work is done, whether that takes until noon or until dusk. Medieval labor, for all its brutality, was task-shaped, not clock-shaped. You worked until the thing was finished, and then this is the part we have nearly lost. You genuinely stopped. There was no notion that idle hours should be filled with more productivity. No sense that time itself was money draining away. When the task was done, the time was yours, and nobody had invented the idea that it shouldn't be. And then there is the ale. When the threshers pause, what they drink is not water, and there is a reason for that, and it is not what people think. It was not that medieval people believed water was poison or never drank it. They drank from clean springs and wells happily enough. It was that ale was food. Brewed weak, the small ale of everyday life had perhaps the strength of a modern light beer or less. And it was packed with calories that a body doing this kind of labor desperately needed. It was made in the home, very often by women brewing, was one of the few trades a peasant woman could turn to coin. And a village alewife who brewed a good batch would hang out a bush or a pole to signal it, and the neighbors would come. So the jug going round that barn is not a vice. It is lunch, and it is mild, and it is one of the few small pleasures the morning offers, earned with aching shoulders. By the time the bell rings for sext, the barley is threshed, and Edith's ode work is done. She walks home through the middle of the day with her flail over her shoulder, and there is a looseness in her now that was not there at dawn, the looseness of a debt paid, of the worst of the day behind her. Those of you who did real physical work for a living, who came up off a farm or worked a factory line or dug and built and hauled for 40 years know this exact feeling, the particular piece of a hard morning finished, the body tired in the good way. It does not need explaining to you. For Edith, the rest of this day, barring the Lord's reeve thinking up some new demand, is more or less her own, and what she will do with it is the quiet question we will come back to when we answer the riddle from the beginning. Because here is something the grim picture of medieval life almost always leaves out. The calendar was full of holes, and the holes were holidays. Not the modern handful. Dozens upon dozens of holy days, saints' feasts, church festivals, the long stretches around Christmas and Easter, on which work was forbidden or sharply reduced. Historians arguing over the exact count land in different places, but a great many reckon the medieval peasant had somewhere between 70 and 100 days a year on which no servile labor was owed, on top of every Sunday. Add it up and compare it, honestly, to your own year of vacation days, and the comparison becomes uncomfortable in a hurry. We will do exactly that arithmetic later, and it is the heart of the riddle. For now, simply hold the strange fact in your hand. This exhausted woman had, scattered across her brutal year, a remarkable number of days that were entirely, legally, hers. If you grew up on the land, or your people did, if you remember the rhythm of work that ended when the work ended, and not when a whistle blew, I would genuinely like to hear about it in the comments tonight. That older sense of time, task-shaped rather than clock-shaped, is one of the things our world has quietly lost, and many of you remember it firsthand, or heard it described by parents who lived it. Your memories are not a footnote to this history. In many ways, they are the closest living thread we have to it. But let us leave Edith resting in her doorway in the thin midday sun, bowl in her lap, the worst of her day behind her, and let us travel. Because the same noon bell that just rang over her village is ringing 20 miles to the east, over a very different scene. Chapter 11, The Wool Merchant, England's Hidden Engine. While Edith is resting in her doorway, 20 miles east, in the town of Lincoln, a man named Geoffrey is counting bales of wool and trying very hard not to look as worried as he feels. Geoffrey is 41 years old, a wool merchant, and he occupies a strange and slippery rung of the medieval ladder, richer than Edith could imagine, poorer and lower born than Sir Walter, and dependent, in the end, on both of them. He buys the wool that grows on the backs of the sheep above Edith's village. He sells it to agents who ship it across the sea. And the cloth he wears, the fine dark wool of his good coat, came in part from Sir Walter's own household, with whom he does careful, deferential business. The three of them are stitched together by threads none of them can see whole. Step into the town with me, because the contrast with the village is the whole point. Where Edith's world was silent but for bells and birds and the wind, Geoffrey's world is a wall of noise, the shouting of traders, the clatter of cartwheels on the few cobbled stretches, the bawling of driven animals, the cry of a dozen tradespeople, each insisting their goods are the finest in Lincolnshire. Where the village smelled of wood smoke and earth and animals, the town smells of all that plus tannery and fish and the open drains running down the middle of the street, a rich and frankly punishing perfume. The town is dirtier, denser, faster, and far more dangerous to the soul, the preachers would say, and far more full of opportunity, the merchants would answer, and both of them were right. What is worrying Geoffrey is money, which in his world is a stranger and more fragile thing than in ours. Look at what is on his table. Silver pennies, and not many of them, because England's coinage was almost entirely silver, and a single penny was a real sum. A laborer might earn a penny or two for a full day's work. There were no banknotes. There was, for everyday purposes, no paper money at all. Large sums were a physical, heavy, countable problem, and trust was the only thing that made commerce possible at scale. And so Geoffrey relies on the tally stick, a notched length of wood, split down the middle so buyer and seller each kept a half that fit only the other, an unforgeable record of debt that the most powerful institutions in England, including the royal treasury, relied on. A stick. A clever, humble, beautiful stick. They were not primitive. They were working, with great ingenuity, inside the tools they had. To survive in this world, Geoffrey belongs to a guild, and the guild is one of the most important and least understood institutions of the medieval town. We hear the word and think of a cozy club. It was far more than that. The guild controlled who could trade and who could not, set the standards for quality so that a buyer in Bruges could trust a Lincoln sack, fixed prices to keep ruinous competition from destroying everyone, trained the young through long apprenticeships, and this is the part that mattered most when the dark came, looked after its own. If Geoffrey died, the guild would help bury him and might help feed his widow and set up his sons. If he fell sick, the guild might tide him over. It was trade association, trade school, insurance company, and funeral society rolled into one, in a world with no government safety net of any kind. You did not survive the town alone. You survived it as a member. Now watch where Edith's wool actually goes, because it is a journey that would have astonished her. The sacks Geoffrey buys are barged down the river, carried to a coastal port, and shipped across the channel to Flanders, to Bruges and Ghent and Ypres, the great cloth-working cities, where English wool was woven into fine cloth that was sold back across all of Europe, sometimes returning to England as a luxury fabric, far too dear for the woman whose sheep had grown it. England in this age was not yet a nation of weavers. It was a nation that grew the world's best raw wool and sold it abroad, and the whole creaking apparatus of merchants and guilds and barges and ships existed to move that one soft, greasy, precious commodity from the hillside to the sea. It was, in its way, the oil of its century, and Geoffrey sat squarely on the pipeline. But Geoffrey's wealth is a nervous, exposed kind of wealth, and the letter on his table is the reason for the frown. 3 things can ruin him almost overnight, and none of them are in his control. The first is the king, who taxes wool. Ferociously, wool was the most reliable thing the crown could squeeze for money to fight its wars, and a new tax or a seizure of merchant stock could fall without warning. The second is war itself, which could close the channel and strand his goods on a wharf, rotting in the rain. The third and the most modern feeling is debt. Much of the great wool trade ran on credit advanced by Italian banking houses, Florentine and Lucchese, and when kings defaulted on those bankers, as they did, spectacularly, more than once the shock ran down the whole chain and swept lesser men like Geoffrey under, He is, in a sense we would recognize instantly, leveraged. And he sleeps about as well as any leveraged man in any age. There is one pleasure of the town we should not pass by, because it is a genuine surprise. Geoffrey can buy his lunch. Lincoln, like every town of any size, had cook shops, the medieval ancestor of fast food, where a man with a few pennies and no kitchen of his own could buy a hot pie, a piece of roasted meat, a portion of something stewed, ready to eat. For a busy merchant, or a laborer lodging in a rented room with no hearth, this was the difference between a hot meal and none. The food was sometimes excellent, and sometimes, by the bitter complaints that survive, reheated, dubious, and best not inquired into too closely. The medieval cookshop and the modern gas station hot dog share a certain spirit of caveat emptor. But it was hot, it was fast, and it existed in the 14th century, which is more than most people would ever guess. Chapter 12, The Riddle, answered, why she rested more than you do. Remember the question we asked at the very beginning, in the dark before Edith's fire was lit. How a woman who owned almost nothing and owed almost everything could somehow end up with more genuine rest than the average person watching tonight. We are at the middle of our day now, and it is time to answer it. And the answer is not a philosophy. The answer is sitting in Edith's lap right now, in the form of a worn wooden bowl held in two still hands, in a patch of thin midday sun on her own threshold, with her owed work behind her and no clock anywhere, telling her this hour should be spent on something more useful. The answer was never about happiness or the human spirit. The answer was the shape of her time. Here is the arithmetic, plainly. Edith works brutally hard on the days she works harder, in raw, physical terms, than almost anyone alive today. But she does not work most days of the year on someone else's clock. Strip out every Sunday on which labor was forbidden, and you have already removed 52 days. Then add the holy days, the saints' feasts, the church festivals, the long easings around Christmas and Easter, and the midsummer, and harvest celebrations, and many careful estimates put the total of non-working days somewhere near a third of the entire year, perhaps 100 days or more beyond the Sundays. There was no concept that leisure was idleness to be ashamed of. When the saints' day came, you did not work, and no one expected you to. And the idea of catching up on a holy day would have struck Edith as something close to blasphemy. Her rest was not stolen in the margins. It was built into the calendar, defended by the church, and as real as the soil. And there is a second half to the answer, quieter than the first, and it is about the nights. We know from a scattering of sources that scholars have pieced together that people in this world very likely slept in two shifts. A first sleep that began not long after dark, then a wakeful hour in the deep of the night, a strange, peaceful interval in which people prayed, talked softly, tended the fire, made love, or simply lay still in the dark, and then a second sleep until dawn. The long, unbroken 8 hours we chase, and so rarely catch, may be a fairly modern invention. Edith's night had a seam in the middle of it, and far from being a disorder, it was simply how the night was shaped, and people met that waking hour calmly, without the modern dread of the 3 a.m. ceiling. So when you ask how she rested, more than you, part of the answer is the 100 holy days. And part of it is that even her sleep was less anxious than ours. We will come back to that wakeful midnight hour at the very end of this journey, because there is something gentle waiting for us there. So that is the riddle solved, and notice that solving it did not require us to leave the world or float up into grand statements about the meaning of suffering. It only required us to look honestly at the shape of a year and the shape of a night. Edith pays for that rest. Make no mistake, with labor that would break most of us, and with a life that is short and precarious, and shadowed by losses we will speak of before the day ends. The medieval bargain was not a good one, and I would not trade you into it. But it was not the unbroken gray misery of the cartoon version either, and the woman resting in her doorway with a bowl in her lap, in a patch of thin sun, is the proof. Now let us not linger here, philosophizing, while there is still half a day to live. There is a third life on this hill we have not yet entered, and the bell that freed Edith at noon is at this very moment summoning a very different man to a very different kind of work. Chapter 13. The Lord in his hall, power, duty, and the view from above. Sir Walter is 52 years old, which in this world makes him genuinely old, a survivor, and he has the aches to prove it. He is a knight, a minor lord, the holder of this manor and one or two others, and if you imagine him lounging in idle luxury, you have him quite wrong. The man has been awake since not long after Edith, has heard Mass in his own chapel, has dealt with his steward about a dispute over a boundary, and is now preparing to do the thing that takes up more of a lord's actual day than feasting or fighting ever did. He is going to hold court. Because Sir Walter is not merely Edith's landlord, he is, within the bounds of this manor, something close to her judge, her magistrate, and her local government, all at once. And that bundle of power is also a bundle of duties he cannot easily put down. The manor court is one of the most revealing institutions in all of medieval life, and it met right here in the hall. To it came the small frictions of the village made large. A man whose pigs had rooted up a neighbor's garden, a woman accused of brewing weak ale and charging full price, a tenant who had let his strip go to weeds and harmed the crop on either side, a quarrel over an inheritance, a broken betrothal. Sir Walter, or more often his steward in his name, heard them out and levied fines, and those fines were both justice and income, which is the uncomfortable knot at the center of the whole thing. The man who judged the village also profited from its misdeeds. And yet the court was not simply tyranny from above. The villagers themselves served as jurors. The customs of the manor were remembered and cited by the community, and a lord who trampled those customs too brazenly could face a sullen, foot-dragging, quietly ungovernable village. Power ran downward, yes, but it did not run unopposed. And we must not leave out the person who actually runs this manor day to day, because she is too often left out of the telling. Lady Joan, Sir Walter's wife, who at this hour is doing work every bit as real as her husband's. The lady of a medieval manor was not an ornament. She held the keys, and the keys were power, the literal control of the storerooms, the buttery, the larder, the precious spices kept under lock. She managed the household accounts, directed a staff of servants, oversaw the brewing and baking and preserving that fed dozens, supervised the dairy and the garden, nursed the sick of the household, and when her husband was away at war or court or law, which could be for months, she ran the entire estate in his place, defended its interests, and sometimes, quite literally, defended its walls. The competent running of Sir Walter's lands rested as much on Joan's ring of keys as on his seal, and any honest portrait of power in this hall has her standing squarely in the middle of it. In the afternoon, with the court concluded, Sir Walter does what a lord was more or less expected to do. He rides out to hunt, and it is tempting to file this under leisure and move on, but the hunt was something more layered than sport. It was training for war, keeping a man and his horse and his nerve sharp for the violence that was the whole original justification for his rank. It was a display of status, the right to take deer and game from land that the peasant below was forbidden, on pain of harsh penalty. To touch the forest laws were among the most hated in England, precisely because they reserved the wild bounty for men like Walter. And it was, beneath all of that, a genuine pleasure. The wind and the speed and the baying of the hounds, one of the real joys of a hard and dutiful life. He is old for it now, and his joints will remind him tomorrow, but he rides anyway, because a lord who cannot ride is a lord halfway to nothing. Now here's the thing about Sir Walter that mirrors Edith more closely than either of them would ever admit. He too owes. He holds this land, but he holds it from someone greater than himself, a powerful baron, and above that baron, the king, and the price of holding it is service, chiefly military service. When the king calls, Sir Walter is bound to appear, armed and horsed, and ready to fight, or to pay others to fight in his place, and to bring a quota of men. The mail and helm on that stand are not decoration. They are the rent. Edith pays in threshed barley in the 10th sheaf. Sir Walter pays in blood and steel and the risk of dying in some muddy field for a quarrel he had no part in starting. The whole pyramid is built of owed things, top to bottom, and no one standing on it, not even near the top, is truly free of the weight pressing down from above. Chapter 14. The Evening Feast in the Theatre of the Hall. As the light fails, the hall fills for the evening meal, and the hall at supper is the beating social heart of the whole manor, part dining room, part courtroom of reputation, part theater of who matters and who does not. Where you sat said everything. The high table on the raised dais was for Sir Walter, Lady Joan, and honored guests. The lower tables ran down the hall in descending order of importance, and the great salt cellar marked the line to be seated below the salt, was to be told, gently and publicly, your exact place in the order of things. The food at the high table was finer: white bread, roasted meats and fowl, dishes brightened with the staggeringly expensive spices that came overland and oversea from the Far East: pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, used not only for flavor, but frankly, to show that one could afford them at all. Watch the plates, or rather watch the absence of them, because even at this table there is a detail that delights me. Much of the eating was done off a trencher, a thick slab of stale bread that served as an edible plate, soaking up the juices and sauces through the meal. At the end, the gravy-soaked trenchers were not eaten by the lord. They were collected and given as alms to the poor at the gate, who waited for exactly this. So the leavings of Sir Walter's table fed, in a small and literal way, people not so very far removed from Edith. The bread that began in fields she may have helped to thresh, returning at last to hands like hers. The chain that runs through this whole day, sheep to wool, to merchant to coin, to land to lord, and back down to bread at the gate, closes quietly in the dark, and almost no one in the hall thinks to notice it. And there was entertainment, because a hall after supper, with the work done and the ale flowing and the fire high, was where a great deal of the joy of medieval life actually lived. A harper or a minstrel might play. There were stories, the long tales of heroes and saints and old battles that everyone half knew and loved to hear again. There was dicing and chess and games. There was song. For those of you who remember evenings before television, when the entertainment was whatever the family or the neighbors could make themselves: a fiddle, a song around a piano, a good story told well by someone who knew how to tell it. You understand the medieval hall at night better than most. It was warm, it was human, it was made by the people in the room, and it was, in its own firelit way, more than enough. Chapter 15. Did they love their children? The hardest question. Earlier today, I promised we would return to a tender and difficult question, and the quiet of the evening is the right time for it. The question is this: did medieval parents love their children the way we do? For a long stretch of the last century, some serious historians argued that they could not have, that when so many children died so young, parents must have armored themselves, held back their love, kept a careful distance from small lives so easily lost. It is a theory that sounds almost reasonable until you actually look at the evidence, and then it falls completely apart. Because the records that survive are full of grief. Coroners' rolls describe parents who drowned trying to save a child, fallen into a well, mothers who ran into fires. Court testimony remembers the exact ages and small habits of the lost. Tomb effigies show dead infants cradled in stone. Edith, who has buried 2 children, did not love the 3 who lived any less carefully for it. If anything, the losses sharpened the love into something fierce and watchful. And Lady Joan, in her fine chamber on the hill, holds a tiny worn shoe in the candlelight, tonight for a child of her own who did not live. And her grief and Edith's are, in the only way that finally matters, exactly the same grief. The hierarchy that separated these 2 women in life does not reach into this. Here they are simply 2 mothers who lost children in a world that took children easily and loved them anyway and completely. Chapter 16. Medicine, Sickness, and the Nearness of Death. Which brings us gently to medicine and to the constant nearness of death that shaped every hour of this day without ever quite being spoken of. There were no antibiotics. A cut that turned bad, a fever that climbed, a difficult birth, a winter cough that settled into the chest, any of these could kill, and often did, with a speed that we, cushioned by modern medicine, can barely imagine. Childbirth was genuinely dangerous, a real risk to a woman's life with each pregnancy, and Edith has run that risk 5 times. To live in this world was to live with death as a near and familiar neighbor, not a distant stranger met once at the end. But here, too, we must resist the easy condescension. The medicine of Edith's world was not all leeches and superstition, though there was plenty of both. The village wise woman who tends the fevered tonight commands a real, hard-won knowledge of herbs, willow bark for pain, which we now know carries the very compound at the heart of aspirin. Honey on wounds, which we now know genuinely fights infection. Comfrey for knitting bones, chamomile for sleep. Much of it worked. It was accumulated over generations, tested against death, passed mother to daughter and neighbor to neighbor, and it represented the best efforts of intelligent people to heal each other with the tools they had. They were not stupid. They were doing careful science without the word for it, in the dark, against an enemy that usually won. And when death came, as it came so often, the community met it with a fullness of ritual that we have largely lost, and that they would have pitied us for lacking. The dying were not hidden away in distant institutions. They died at home, in the one room, surrounded by family, attended by the priest. The body was washed and watched and waked by people who knew it. The whole village came to the burial in the churchyard, that crowded green beside the church where generations lay close together in unmarked ground. Death was terrible, but it was not lonely, and it was not strange, and the dead were not forgotten. They were prayed for, named, kept. There is a hard kind of comfort in that which our own age, for all its safety, has not entirely managed to replace. Chapter 17. Keeping clean in a world without plumbing. Let us talk, quietly and without too many questions, about hygiene, because here is another place the cartoon of the filthy medieval peasant misleads us. Yes, people were dirtier than us by necessity, because every drop of warm water cost firewood and a back-breaking haul from the well. But the idea that medieval people wallowed in filth and never washed is simply false. They washed their hands and faces daily, often before and after meals. They cleaned their teeth with twigs and cloths and herbal pastes. They combed out their hair against the lice that everyone, high and low, contended with. They valued clean linen against the skin, precisely because the body could not be bathed often, and a fresh undershift was the medieval substitute for a shower. They cared. They simply could not afford the war against dirt that hot, running water lets us win without thinking. In the towns, in fact, there were public bathhouses, the stews where a townsman like Geoffrey could pay to soak in hot water, and which were popular enough that the church fretted constantly about what else went on in them, usually with good reason. Bathing was a pleasure people sought out when they could afford it, not a thing they feared. As for the less mentionable necessities, the privies, the cesspits, the chamber pots, emptied with a shout of warning into the street gutter at dawn, let us draw the curtain there, except to say that the medieval town's relationship with its own waste was every bit as grim as you imagine, that it ran in open channels down the middle of the streets, and that it was more than war or even famine, the reason the towns were so much deadlier than the clean-aired village. Density had a price, and the price was disease. Chapter 18. The Turning Year. Living by the Seasons. We have followed a single day, but no day in this world made sense outside the great wheel of the agricultural year, which ruled Edith's life far more than any king. The year was not a flat line of identical weeks. It was a steep landscape of seasons, each with its own urgent, unavoidable work. The autumn we are in now is for plowing and sowing the winter wheat, and for slaughtering the animals that cannot be fed through the cold. Winter is for survival, for mending and spinning, and the careful eking out of the harvest's store. Spring is for plowing again, for the spring-sown crops, for the desperate hungry gap when last year's food runs thin and this year's is not yet ripe. And summer builds toward the one season that mattered above all others. That season was the harvest, and the harvest was everything. For a few frantic weeks in late summer, the entire village, man, woman, and child, free and unfree, even the reluctant and the old, threw themselves at the ripe grain in a race against the weather, because rain on cut grain was ruin, and ruin meant a winter of hunger. Everyone worked from first light to last. Even the Lord's harshest labor demands were, in their grim way, simply part of the same desperate communal effort to get the food in before the sky turned. Those of you who brought in crops yourselves, who know the particular dread of watching a storm build over a field not yet cut, who worked dawn to dark beside your whole family because the harvest does not wait, this season, in your hands and your back. It has barely changed in 700 years. The machines are new. The race against the rain is exactly as old as farming itself. Chapter 19. the village as a web: community, custom, and survival. We have spoken of what the village owed upward, but we have not yet spoken of what held it together sideways. And that web of mutual obligation was, in the end, the thing that kept people alive. A medieval village was not a collection of isolated households. It was a dense, prickly, deeply interdependent community in which everyone knew everyone, where privacy, as we understand it, barely existed, and where survival depended on cooperation enforced by a relentless social pressure. You shared the great Plough team because no single family owned enough oxen to pull it. The strips in the open field were scattered deliberately so that good land and bad were shared out fairly. The harvest was a joint assault. Cross the community badly, and you could find no one would lend you an ox, work beside you, or speak for you in court. And the law reached right down into this web in a way that bound neighbors to one another, whether they liked it or not. Under the old system of frank pledge, the men of the village were grouped into small bands, each member answerable for the conduct of the others. If one of your group committed a crime and fled, the rest could be fined for failing to produce him. It was policing without police, justice resting on the shoulders of the community itself. It made for a watchful, knowing, sometimes suffocating world, where your business was everyone's business, and a wrongdoer had nowhere to hide among people who had known him since birth. But it also meant that no one was entirely alone, that the community was a unit that rose and fell together, and that the bonds between neighbors were not sentimental, but load-bearing. They held weight. Lives hung on them. This is also where the much-maligned medieval world quietly outshines its reputation, because the community that watched you so closely also caught you when you fell. There was no state welfare, but there was the parish, the guild, the manor's customary obligations to its old and its widowed, and above all, the simple, unwritten, ferociously honored duty of neighbor to neighbor. A widow might be allowed to glean the fields, given the leftover grain after the harvest as a customary right. A family burned out or struck down by illness would find food appearing at the door. Charity was not a tax form. It was a face you knew, bringing a covered bowl in the dusk, expecting that one day the direction of the kindness would reverse. It was imperfect, it could be stingy, and it could be cruel to those it judged undeserving. But it was real, it was human, and it was there. Chapter 20, The Work of Women, Without Which Nothing Held. We have followed Edith and Joan all day, but it is worth stopping to name plainly how much of this entire world rested on the work of women, because the old histories so often left it in the shadows. A peasant woman's day was not a lesser version of a man's. It was a second, parallel, unending economy. She bore and raised the children, yes, but she also brewed the ale that was half the household's calories and could be sold for precious coin. She spun the wool endlessly, the distaff tucked under her arm, even as she walked or watched the pot, so that spinster came to mean an unmarried woman, because spinning was the work that filled a woman's every spare moment. She kept the kitchen garden, tended the poultry and the dairy, made the cheese and butter, preserved and salted and stored, gathered firewood, hauled the water, and in the harvest worked the fields beside the men. And in the towns, women's work spilled well beyond the home. Women brewed and sold ale, ran market stalls, worked as spinsters and seamstresses and laundresses, kept shops alongside their husbands, and often ran them alone as widows. And in some trades were admitted, carefully, into the guilds. A widow could inherit her husband's business and his place in the trade, and some became formidable merchants in their own right. The medieval world was patriarchal to its bones, and a woman's legal standing was hedged and limited in ways that would rightly outrage us now. But the picture of medieval women as silent, powerless, and confined is a flattening of a far more complicated truth. They held keys, kept accounts, ran estates, brewed and sold and traded, healed the sick, and carried on their backs an enormous share of the labor that kept everyone, lord and laborer alike, alive. Nothing in this day we have watched would have held together without them. Chapter 21. The Wider World. Roads, pilgrims, and the edge of the map. Before we let the night come down, let us widen the frame one last time, because it is easy to imagine these people as utterly sealed in their villages, and that too is only half true. Yes, most peasants lived and died within a few miles of their birthplace, and a journey of 20 miles to Lincoln was, for Edith, a genuine expedition, undertaken rarely. But the roads were not empty. They carried packmen with needles and ribbons and news, drovers moving herds, royal messengers, friars walking from village to village, and most wonderfully pilgrims. The pilgrimage was the great journey of the medieval ordinary person, the one time a humble soul might travel far, to a local saint at shrine, or to the great shrine of St. Thomas at Canterbury, or for the bold and the wealthy, across a whole continent toward Rome or Jerusalem. A pilgrimage was many things at once: an act of devotion, a hope of healing, a penance for sin, and, let us be honest, a holiday, a chance to see something of the world with the blessing of the church while upon the journey. The roads to the great shrines were lined with inns and hospitals, and the medieval equivalent of souvenir sellers hawking pilgrim badges of tin. The stories told along the way to pass the miles became, in the hands of one customs official and poet named Geoffrey Chaucer, writing not so very long after our day, the greatest portrait we have of the whole cross-section of this society, knight and miller and wife and pardoner, riding together and talking, the entire social world we have watched today, jostling along one muddy road. The village was small, but it had windows onto something vast, and the people in it knew, however dimly, that they belonged to a Christendom that stretched far beyond the edge of any field they would ever plough. Chapter 22. Crime, Punishment, and the King's Peace. We have seen how the manor court handled the small frictions of the village, but there was a harder edge to medieval justice, and it is worth looking at squarely, because it shaped how safe or unsafe these people felt in their own lanes. Violence was nearer the surface than in our world. Quarrels that we would settle with words, or lawyers were sometimes settled with fists, knives, or the heavy farm tools that every household owned, and the coroner's rolls record a steady toll of deaths from brawls, drunken accidents, and sudden rage. This was not a gentle age, but it was also not the lawless free-for-all of legend. Over and above the Lord's court stood the king's law, the king's peace, and the most serious crimes, murder, robbery, arson, rape, were the king's business, tried before royal justices who traveled the country on circuit. Punishment, when it came, was public, and that was the whole point of it. There were no prisons as we know them. Locking a man up and feeding him for years served no purpose anyone could see. Justice was meant to be seen, to shame, to warn, and to restore the broken peace of the community in the open air. The stocks and the pillory held a cheating baker or a foul-mouthed scold up to the mockery of their neighbors for an afternoon. Fines were the commonest penalty by far, paid to lord or king. And for the gravest crimes there was the gallows, swift and terrible and meant to be witnessed. It was harsh, and it could be brutally unjust, and it fell hardest on the poor, as such things always have. But it was not arbitrary cruelty for its own sake. It was a community with almost no police, no prisons, and no forensics, doing its rough best to hold the peace with the only tools it had: shame, restitution, and the rope. Chapter 23: Festivals, Games, and the Art of Having Fun. But let us not end the village's story on the gallows, because that would be a lie about how these people actually lived, and they would not thank us for it. Remember those dozens of holy days we counted earlier? Well, those days were not spent sitting quietly. They were the great release valve of medieval life, and the village knew how to use them. There were games, and they were rougher than ours, a kind of mass football played between whole villages, with few rules and many bruises. The ball pursued across fields and through streams by a heaving mob. Wrestling, archery at the butts, bowling, quoits, and 100 contests of strength and skill that let young men show off and old men remember. There was no neat line between sport and chaos, and a festival football match could leave more casualties than a small skirmish, all in perfectly good cheer. And there was feasting, real feasting, on days when the careful thrift of the year was deliberately set aside. The great festivals of the church calendar, Christmas with its 12 days, Easter, Whitsun, the harvest home, the parish's own Saint's Day, were marked with food and drink that a family had saved and planned for, with music and dancing on the green, with ritual and mischief, and the temporary, joyful turning upside down of the ordinary order. For those of you who remember a time when holidays meant the whole community gathering, when the church hall or the village green filled with people you had known your whole life, when entertainment was something you made together rather than something you watched alone, you understand the medieval festival in your bones. The work was hard, but when these people played, they played with a wholeheartedness our distracted age can only envy. The joy was real, and it was shared, and it was earned. Chapter 24: Letters, Learning, and the Spoken World. We should pause on something we've taken for granted all day. Almost no one in Edith's village can read. Literacy in this world was rare, precious, and concentrated overwhelmingly in the church and among the great. Edith cannot read or write, nor can her husband, nor will most of her children, and this was not a mark of stupidity, but simply of a world in which the written word was a specialist's tool, like surgery, that ordinary life did not require. Hers was an oral culture, a world that ran on memory, and the spoken word on stories told and retold by the fire, on prayers and proverbs known by heart, on the testimony of elders who remembered the customs of the manor because remembering them was their job. People who cannot write often have memories that would shame us, and Edith carries in her head a library of song, story, recipe, remedy, and ancestral rite that no shelf in her house could hold. But learning did exist, fiercely guarded and slowly spreading, in the monasteries and cathedrals, where monks copied by hand the books that carried the whole of Western knowledge across the dark centuries: scripture, the classics, law, medicine, philosophy, each volume a staggering labor of months, written on prepared animal skin, illuminated with colors and gold that still blaze on the page 700 years later. And the world was changing, even as Edith lived. The great universities at Oxford and Cambridge were already old. The towns were breeding a class of literate merchants and clerks and lawyers like Geoffrey, who could keep accounts and read a contract. And the slow tide of the written word was rising toward the day, still far off, when a woman like Edith might learn her letters. She would not live to see it, but her great-great-granddaughters would, and the first faint pull of that tide was already in the air she breathed. Chapter 25. Fairs, Coins, and the Reach of the Market. A few times a year, though, the wider world came thundering right up to the edge of Edith's life in the form of the Great Fair, and the fair was an event where the weekly market handled eggs and ale and the small local trade. The seasonal fair drew merchants from across England and beyond, cloth and spices, fine ironware and pottery, exotic goods that ordinary people would see perhaps once a year and remember for the rest of it. A fair was commerce, yes, but it was also theater and pilgrimage and carnival all at once. Jugglers and minstrels, relics to venerate, food to gob at, news from distant places, and the rare, dizzying chance for a peasant to lay eyes on the sheer variety of the world. Edith might walk to one such fair in a year, buy almost nothing, and talk about it for months. And the fair is where you could really see how money worked in this world, which was stranger and more physical than ours. England's coin was silver, and the workhorse was the silver penny, but a penny was a real sum, too large for many small purchases, so people simply cut the coins, halving or quartering a penny with a knife to make halfpennies and farthings, literal fractions of metal weighed on a balance. There were no banks for ordinary folk, no notes, no credit cards, no abstraction at all between you and your wealth. Money was metal you could bite, weigh, hide, and lose, and a hoard was a literal hole in the ground, or a pot up the chimney, Geoffrey's tally sticks, and the Italian bankers' letters of credit were the cutting edge of high finance. But down here at the fair, for Edith, money was exactly what it looked like. A few thin slivers of cut silver, knotted into a corner of cloth, counted twice, and spent with enormous care. Chapter 26. First Sleep and Second Sleep. The Medieval Night. Now the light is finally, fully gone, and the night comes down over all three of our lives at once. Over Edith in her croft, Geoffrey in his townhouse above the silent counting room, Sir Walter in his curtained bed in the hall on the hill, and the night, in this world before electric light, was a country of its own, deep and total and long, in a way we can scarcely imagine. There were no streetlights. There was no glow on the horizon from a distant city. When the moon was down and the clouds were in, the dark was absolute, the kind of dark that presses on the eyes. And into that dark, the medieval world went every night with only banked fires and the patient knowledge that the sun always, eventually, came back. And here, at last, is the gentle thing I promised you we would find waiting in the dark. Remember when we said that the medieval night had a seam in the middle of it? A first sleep, then a waking, then a second sleep? This is that waking hour now. All across the village, all across England, people are stirring in the deep middle of the night. Not in alarm, not in the modern 3 a.m. dread, but calmly, expecting it. Edith sits up in the ember's faint glow and feeds a twig to the fire. Somewhere, a couple talks softly in the dark. Someone prays. Someone simply lies still and listens to the wind and the breathing of children and feels, for one quiet hour, entirely at peace in a world that asks nothing of them at all. Then they will lie back down and sleep again until dawn. There is something in that quiet midnight hour that I find I envy, and I suspect some of you will too. We have built a world of astonishing comfort and safety, A world Edith would have wept to see, a world of warm rooms and full plates, and children who almost all lived to grow up. And I would not trade it back for anything, nor should you. But somewhere in the building of it, we mislaid that calm dark hour. We taught ourselves to fear the waking in the night, to reach for the glowing screen, to lie rigid and anxious in the small hours, counting the rest we are losing. Edith, who had so much less than us in every measurable way, had that one thing we have lost, a night that was allowed to have a seam in it, in a darkness she did not fear. Chapter 27. What the day leaves us. A closing reflection. So that is the day, one full turn of the sun over a corner of medieval England, from Edith waking in the dark before the birds, to Edith waking again in the gentle middle of the night, with a whole world lived in between. We watched a peasant woman save a fire and pay her labor and rest in a patch of thin sun. We watched a merchant count silver and worry over a sea he could not control. We watched a lord hold court and ride to hunt and sit at the high table, owing his own debts upward into the dark. 3 lives, 3 rungs, one world stitched together by wool and bread and bell, and the long custom of who owes what to whom, a fabric so tightly woven that no thread in it could have been pulled without the rest of it shifting. And they are still here, if you know how to look. Walk certain English fields at dawn, and you will see the ground rippling in long low ridges under the grass, the ridge and furrow of medieval ploughing, the literal shape of Edith's labor pressed into the earth and surviving 7 centuries, longer than any cathedral, longer than any king's name. The words we use are full of them. Spinster and tally, the very names of our weekdays still ringing with their hours. The hedgerows, the parish churches, the bend of an old road that follows a boundary no one remembers drawing. This is their world, still underfoot, still shaping ours, quietly, the way the dead so often do. What I keep coming back to as this day closes is how easy it is to pity these people, and how badly that pity misses them. Yes, their lives were hard, past anything most of us will ever know. They were cold and hungry and grieving and bound, and they died young, and I would not wish their world on anyone. But they were not a gray mass of suffering, waiting to be rescued by the centuries to come. They were intelligent, resourceful, funny, devout, and stubbornly, gloriously alive. They made beauty out of almost nothing songs and stories, and carved stone in the long, patient art of getting one more winter behind them. They loved their children fiercely and buried them, and loved the next ones just as hard. They built a world on owed labor in the 10th sheaf, and inside that world they found rest and joy in one another. They endured so that there could be an us. And the warm room you are lying in tonight is, in the most literal and unbroken way, the inheritance of their endurance. And so, we let them sleep. Edith by her banked fire, with her children breathing in the dark, and her ox warm behind the partition, and the worst of tomorrow not yet arrived. Geoffrey above his silent ledgers, his worries waiting patiently for the dawn. Sir Walter in his curtained bed, old and aching and dutiful, the hall gone quiet below him. 3 lives settling into the same long medieval night, under the same dark sky, in the same hard and beautiful world. A world that is gone now, entirely gone, and yet not gone at all, because here we are, 700 years downstream, still warmed by fires they learned to keep. If tonight's slow journey stirred something, a memory of your own, of work that ended when the work was done, of a grandparent's stories about the years before, the easy comforts we forget to be grateful for, or simply a quiet fellow feeling for these people across the long centuries, I would be honored if you left it down in the comments. Your perspective, your memories, the things your family carried forward and told you belong in this story as much as anything I've said tonight. Those of you who worked the land, who kept a fire going through hard winters, who knew scarcity and made do and made beauty anyway, your voices are the closest living echo of the world we just walked through. The comment section is yours. And in the quiet of history, their voices still echo, if we are only willing to listen. The fields they plowed are still rippling under the grass. The fires they kept are, in a manner of speaking, still warm. Rest well tonight, wherever you are. Let the dark be gentle. And I will see you, as always, in the next one.